Hello, welcome to Better English in Tacoma. My name is Linda, and today's video is part 2 of a 2-part series on the sounds of S and Z, the S and Z sounds. We saw in part 1 that the S and Z sounds are formed with our mouth and tongue in the same position, but the S does not use our voice, S, and the Z does use our voice, Z. We also saw that different letters can cause these two sounds. In today's video, we're going to look at which letters make the S and Z sounds and how to know when you see a word whether to use the S or the Z sound. Let's look first at that S sound, S. It can be formed by the letter S or, in some instances, by the letter C. And this can happen at the beginning, the middle, or the end of a word. The S sound in soda comes from an S, but in circle it comes from a C, and these are at the beginning of the words. At the middle of the word, we have an S making the S sound in inside, but in proceed, it comes from a C. And at the end of a word, we have bus with an S or price with a C. And that C is not technically the last letter in the word, but because the E is silent, the S sound is at the end of the word. So the letter C, we've seen that it can make an S sound. It can also make a K sound, K. How do we know which is which? Well, if the C comes before an E, an I, or a Y, it will sound like an S, as in the words cease, cider, and cycle. If the C comes before any other letter, it will sound like a K, as in the words cake, clear, cone, and curb. So let's look at the sounds of the letter S. We already saw that the S can sound like an S, and usually the S does sound like an S when it's at the beginning of a word. We saw that in the word soda. Here are some other examples: sap, see, sip, slip, soap, star, and sun. There is an exception. If the S is followed by an H, then we make the sh sound, as in the words shake, shear, should, and shut. We've already talked about exceptions in the English language, and there is an exception to this S sounding like S. If the single S is in the words sugar or sure, it will sound like that SH. But those are the only two exceptions and words that are built off of sugar and sure. So at the beginning of a word, the S will usually sound like an S, but at the middle or end of a word, the S can sound like an S or it can sound like a Z. Let's look at some examples where it still sounds like an S. In the middle of the word, we had the word inside before. We also have the word prospect or instant. And at the end of a word, we have bus, we saw that before, makes, or cats. But sometimes that letter S makes a Z sound in the middle or the end of a word. In the middle of a word where the S makes the Z, we have words like husband, reason, and busy. And at the end of a word, is, has, goes, or days. Now, what about that Z sound? Which letters can make a Z sound? Well, Z can come from 3 letters: an X, an S, or a Z. And the Z at the beginning of a word will sound like a Z, as in zebra. We've already said that S, when it's at the beginning of a word, will make the S sound. So we don't have any Z sound words that start with an S. But sometimes the Z sound will be at the beginning of a word with an X letter, like in the word xylophone. In the middle of a word, all three of these letters can make the Z sound. In the name Ezra, in the word busy, the Z sound comes from an S. And in the word exist, it's like an E-G-Z-I-S-T, but formed with that X. And at the end of a word, the Z will give us a Z sound, as in the word graze, and an S can give us a Z sound in the word his, and the X does not give us a Z sound when it occurs at the end of a word. So this Z sound can be formed by three different letters, the X, the Z, and the S. And interestingly enough, it is more often formed by an S than it is by a Z. We see that in 72% of the times, that Z sound is from a letter S. So how do we know when to make a Z sound? Well, the letter Z sounds like Z wherever it occurs in a word. At the beginning, we have zero. In the middle, we have azure. And at the end, we have jazz. The X will sometimes sound like a GZ, as in the words exact, exit, and example. And then the letter S will sometimes sound like a Z at the middle or an end of a word. And that can be words like chosen, easy, says, or these. So, when does an S sound like a Z? How do you know? Well, when an S follows a vowel sound, it will sound like a Z, as in as, trays, please, nosy, and music. When S follows a voiced consonant sound, the B, the D, the G, the L, M, N, the ng, the R, and the V. If an S follows one of those, it will make the Z sound. Here are some examples. Observe, beds, sags, bells, and rings. And when S or ES is used to make a plural, it will usually form that Z sound, as in walls, dishes, chairs, or papers. All of those have that Z sound at the end. Now, S will also sound like a Z if it is in a verb. So here are some examples of noun-verb pairs where we have the verb sound first with a Z and the noun word second with that S. So use is a verb, but use, I have no use for that, is a noun. It has the S sound. House, I'm going to house my relatives when they visit. In my house, noun with an S sound. To close the door, or I am close to my sister. Advise with an Z sound versus advice with an S sound. Advise is a verb, advice is a noun. Excuse, please excuse me. I have no excuse, noun with an S, for my behavior. And lastly, we have the example lose. I don't want to lose my ring. And loss, the noun. It was a great loss. So if the word is a verb, it will be the Z sound A corresponding noun will have that S sound. Here's a sentence with the S and the Z sounds. I'll read it once, and then we'll talk about those sounds. My husband gives his patients close exams once flu season arrives. My husband gives his patients close exams once flu season arrives. Here we have the letters making the Z sound in blue and the S sound in red. My husband, that's the S making a Z sound, gives a plural. His, again, a Z sound. Patience, here the S is following a voiced consonant, the T, so it has the S sound. Close, this is an adjective, so it's not a verb. We're going to have the S sound. Exams, again, it's a plural for that Z sound at the end. The X makes the GZ sound. The word once has the S sound formed by a C, and then flu season. Season has two S's, one giving us the S sound, season. The second S gives us the Z sound. And arrives, again, that Z sound at the end. So, I hope this has helped you. We found that the S and the Z have the same mouth position and tongue position, but the S does not use our voice, and it can come from the letters S and C. The Z does use our voice, and it can come from the letters Z, S, and X. Have a great day, and we hope to see you again on Better English in Tacoma.